If you're listening to this, you may drift off before the end. So before you do, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. Before we start, drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is. Now, close your eyes. Just relax, take a deep breath, and let everything go. Good night. Now we can begin. I moved into this neighborhood for a fresh start. It was quiet, peaceful, just the way I wanted it. The houses were old but well maintained, each with a neat lawn and a porch swing that creaked in the wind. Everything felt normal until I met the neighbors. The Thompsons lived directly across from me, a family of 4. Mother, father, and 2 teenage kids. They were friendly enough, too friendly. Their smiles lingered just a second too long. Their eyes never held the tired weight of a long day. But what unsettled me the most was that, no matter what time of day or night, they were always awake. At first, I chalked it up to coincidence. Maybe they were just early risers. Maybe I just happened to see them when they were active. But then I started noticing the patterns, or rather, the lack of them. I'd go to bed at midnight, and their lights would still be on. I'd wake up at 3:00 a.m. for water, and through my window I'd see them, sitting on their porch, still as statues. I'd leave for work at 7:30 in the morning, and there they'd be, watering their flowers, waving at me with eerie consistency. It wasn't just that they were awake. It was how they moved. Their actions were robotic, rehearsed. The father, Mr. Thompson, would mow the lawn every morning, even when it didn't need mowing. The mother, Mrs. Thompson, would sweep the driveway, even when it was spotless. The kids, they sat on the porch, side by side, their heads tilting in unison whenever a car passed by. Then came the night that changed everything. I had been struggling to sleep, my mind fixated on the eerie patterns of my neighbors. I decided to test a theory. If I stayed up late enough, I'd eventually catch them asleep right. So I waited. Midnight passed, then 2:00 a.m., then 4:00 a.m., nothing. Their house was still lit, their silhouettes unmoving through the curtains. I felt an icy chill creep down my spine. Something wasn't right. At 4:17 a.m., I did something I shouldn't have. I peeked through my blinds, just a crack, just enough to see. And that's when I realized they were watching me. All 4 of them, standing in their yard, perfectly still, staring at my house, at me. I stumbled back, my heart pounding. When I dared to look again, they hadn't moved an inch. Their faces were blank, their expressions empty. But I knew, deep in my gut, I wasn't just being watched. I was being studied. I stood frozen, my breath shallow as I peered through the small gap in my blinds. The Thompsons remained motionless in their yard, facing my house. No shifting weight, no fidgeting, just standing. Watching, a deep sense of unease coiled in my stomach. What kind of family just stands outside at 4 in the morning? Were they sleepwalking, playing some kind of prank? But their faces, their expressions were blank, unreadable. Their posture rigid, and their eyes dark, unblinking, locked onto my house with an intensity that sent a cold chill up my spine. I stepped back from the window, my heart pounding in my chest. Maybe if I ignored them, they'd go away. Maybe I was just overreacting, but the feeling didn't fade. I lay in bed, eyes fixed on the ceiling, every nerve on edge. Sleep was impossible. I kept glancing toward the window, expecting them to be inside. The idea was irrational, but something about them felt wrong. At 5:12 a.m., curiosity got the better of me. I crept back to the window, peeking through the blinds again. They were gone, the yard was empty, no sign of movement, no shifting shadows, just silence. I let out a slow, shaky breath. Maybe they had gone back inside. Maybe it really had been some bizarre joke, or maybe I was just too deprived to think straight. The relief didn't last long. The next night, the same thing happened. At exactly 4:17 a.m., I woke up to an uneasy feeling. This time, I didn't even have to check. I knew they were there. Still, I forced myself to look, and there they were, standing in the same spot, staring, but something was different this time. Mrs. Thompson's head was tilted, just slightly. Her mouth was open. I couldn't see her expression clearly in the dim light, but something about the way she stood, slightly off balance, made my skin crawl. Then, without warning, she took a step forward, just one. A sharp knock rattled my front door. My stomach dropped. They weren't just watching anymore. They were coming closer. The knock echoed through my quiet house like a gunshot. I didn't move, didn't breathe, didn't blink. Just stood there, frozen, my fingers gripping the windowsill so tightly they ached. The Thompsons, still standing in their yard, hadn't moved. At least, not that I could see. But the knock, it had come from my front door. Which meant someone, or something, was already at my house. Another knock, louder this time. I forced myself to step away from the window, my heart slamming against my ribs. My legs felt unsteady as I crept toward the door, careful to avoid making a sound. The air felt heavier, thicker, like I was walking through a fog of unseen pressure. When I reached the peephole, I hesitated. Every instinct in my body screamed not to look, but I did. And I almost wished I hadn't. Mrs. Thompson, she was right there, standing at my doorstep. Her lips were still parted, her mouth hanging slightly open, like she had started to say something and then forgotten how to speak. Her pupils were wide, black voids in the dim porch light. She wasn't blinking. I held my breath, waiting for her to move, to speak, but she didn't. She just stood there, watching. Another knock, this time softer, deliberate. My skin crawled. It wasn't a normal knock. 3 slow taps, spaced evenly apart, rhythmic, too precise. I took a shaky step back, my mind racing. What the hell was I supposed to do? Open the door, call the cops, pretend I wasn't home? I reached for my phone, my fingers slick with sweat. But before I could dial, something even worse happened. A second knock from the back door. Cold terror shot through me. That door led to my backyard. The only way to get there was by going through the side gate. And I hadn't heard it open. Whoever was back there had already been there, waiting. The back door had no peephole, no way for me to see who, or what, was standing outside. I swallowed hard, my throat dry as sandpaper. Then, just as I was about to turn, I heard something new. A whisper, low, raspy, just barely audible, let us in. Every hair on my body stood on end. Mrs. Thompson's mouth hadn't moved, but the whisper had come from her direction. A slow creak sounded from the back of the house. The doorknob was turning. I didn't move. I couldn't. The air in my house had thickened, heavy with something I couldn't name, something unnatural. The whisper still rang in my ears, let us in. Mrs. Thompson was still standing at my front door, her eyes locked onto the peephole, as if she knew I was watching. Her lips hadn't moved. She hadn't knocked again, but I knew what I had heard, and worse, someone was at my back door. The doorknob rattled again, this time with more force. I took a shaky step backward, my breath shallow, my mind scrambling for answers. What do they want? Why are they here? Then I remembered. The Thompsons had never knocked before, not once. In the entire time I'd lived here, they had never stepped foot on my porch, never walked to my front door, never interacted with me in any way. They had always just watched, until tonight. My pulse pounded against my temples as I crept toward the back of the house, every footstep feeling too loud. The back door had no curtains, no blinds. If I got too close, whoever was outside would see me. I stopped just short of the doorway, heart hammering. Another whisper, this time from the back, let us in. The voice was different now, lower, stretched, like someone was speaking through a layer of static. It sent a shiver through my spine. I forced myself to look. Through the glass I saw him, Mr. Thompson, standing impossibly still. His face was barely illuminated by the dim porch light, casting long shadows over his features. But his eyes were wrong, not blank like before, not the same void, like stare I'd grown used to. They were locked onto mine, unblinking, and something moved behind them. I stumbled back, a strangled noise catching in my throat. The doorknob twisted hard violently. I bolted for the front. Mrs. Thompson was still there, still watching, still waiting. I had to do something, call the cops, but what would I even tell them? That my neighbors, the people I had never seen sleep, were now knocking on my doors in the middle of the night like mannequins brought to life. The air in the house grew colder. Then, all at once, the knocking stopped. Both doors. Silence swallowed the house, pressing against my ears like cotton. I stayed frozen, every muscle in my body coiled. And then, for the first time since I had moved here, I heard something that made my stomach drop. Footsteps inside my house. The footsteps were soft but deliberate, moving across my floor with a slow, creeping certainty. I couldn't breathe. I had locked the doors, I was sure of it, but something was inside. The air had changed again, thick and pressing, like the house itself was watching me. My heartbeat pounded in my ears as I pressed my back against the wall, forcing my breaths to slow. I needed to stay quiet. I needed to listen, and then I realized there were more than one set of footsteps, one from the front of the house, one from the back, both moving toward me. I took a step back, my socked feet barely making a sound against the hardwood floor. My body was tense, my muscles locked with fear. This isn't possible. I was alone. I was alone. A shadow shifted at the end of the hallway. Tall, unmoving, I swallowed, my mouth dry as sandpaper. Then, in the dim light, I saw it. Mrs. Thompson, standing at the far end of the hallway, still as a statue, her hands at her sides, her mouth slightly open. But her eyes, they weren't looking at me. They were looking past me, like there was something behind me. A cold, crawling sensation ran down my spine. I turned my head slowly, carefully, toward the back of the house. And that's when I saw him, Mr. Thompson, standing just inside my kitchen. The same blank stare, the same stillness. Except now he was inside. They had let themselves in. My breath hitched as my mind screamed for me to move, to run, to do something. But my body refused to obey. I was caught in their presence, trapped in the eerie, unnatural silence. And then, in perfect unison, they blinked, for the first time, a slow, deliberate blink, and then, at the exact same time, they smiled. Not wide, not exaggerated, just a slow, knowing curl of the lips. The kind of smile someone gives when they understand something you don't. And that's when I realized they weren't watching me anymore. They were waiting. The next morning, I left the house before sunrise. I hadn't slept. I hadn't even blinked since that moment in the hallway when the Thompsons stood inside my home, smiling at me like they knew something I didn't. They hadn't moved. They hadn't spoken. They had just stood there until I forced myself to back away, lock myself in my bedroom, and wait for morning. I didn't check if they were still inside. I didn't want to know. Now, standing outside, the air was sharp and cold. The early morning mist rolled along the pavement as I walked quickly, my backpack slung over my shoulder. I had no real destination, just a deep, unshakable need to be somewhere else. The streets were mostly empty, save for a few cars passing in the distance. I walked until I reached the main road, where the only open business was a 24-hour diner, its neon sign buzzing weakly in the dawn light. I stepped inside. The warmth of the diner wrapped around me like a blanket, the smell of coffee and bacon a stark contrast to the hollow, lifeless atmosphere of my neighborhood. I slid into a booth near the window, my fingers drumming against the table. The waitress, a woman in her 50s with tired eyes, approached with a coffee pot in hand. "Rough night?" she asked, pouring me a cup before I could even answer. "You have no idea," I muttered, wrapping my hands around the warm ceramic mug. She gave me a sympathetic smile and left me to my thoughts. I tried to gather myself, to push away the creeping fear that had followed me from my house. Maybe I was imagining things. Maybe stress and lack of sleep were making me paranoid. But then I saw them. Through the large diner window across the street, the Thompsons, standing at the corner, perfectly still. Watching me, a jolt of terror shot through me, my breath catching in my throat. My fingers tightened around the coffee cup. They hadn't followed me here. There was no way. I had walked nearly 2 miles, taken random turns, and avoided familiar routes. And yet here they were, standing side by side, silent, unblinking. A truck passed between us, and when it was gone, so were they. I shot up from my seat, knocking over my coffee. The hot liquid spilled across the table, but I barely noticed. My head whipped around, scanning the street. Nothing. The street corner was empty. Had I imagined it? No, I was sure of what I saw. I forced myself to sit back down, wiping my hands on a napkin. My mind raced through explanations, but none of them made sense. And then a quiet tap on the diner window. I froze. Slowly, I turned my head. The window was fogged up from the warmth inside, but there, just on the glass, were 5 fingerprints. Fresh, perfectly aligned, like someone had just pressed their hand against the glass and vanished. My stomach churned as a cold sweat broke out on my skin. The waitress walked past, glancing at my pale face. "You okay, hon?" I opened my mouth, then closed it again. What could I even say? That my neighbors didn't sleep, that they had been inside my house, that they were here, following me across town without taking a single step. I forced a weak smile. "Yeah, I lied, just tired." She nodded, unconvinced, and walked away. I stared at the fingerprints on the glass. And then I realized there was something off about them. The fingers were too long. I left the diner as soon as the sun fully rose, but the unease didn't fade. My steps were quick, my head on a swivel. Every shadow felt stretched too long. Every stranger's gaze lingered a second too much. The fingerprints on the window, I couldn't stop thinking about them. They had been wrong, too long. Too thin, not human. I needed to clear my head, so I did what I always did when I felt like I was losing control. I went to the library. The town library was old, tucked away between newer buildings like it had been forgotten. Inside, it smelled of aging paper and dust, the kind of place that absorbed whispers and never let them go. I nodded at the librarian, an elderly man with thick glasses, and made my way toward the back. I wasn't looking for anything specific, just an escape. But then I saw them, not the Thompsons, something worse. I stopped dead in my tracks at the sight of a man standing in the philosophy aisle, his back turned to me. He was wearing a black overcoat, his hands resting at his sides. At first, I thought nothing of him, just another visitor. But then I noticed he wasn't moving, not browsing, not shifting weight, just standing there, motionless. I took a slow step forward, my heart pounding. The closer I got, the more wrong he looked. His posture was too stiff. His arms hung too straight, like a mannequin. And then, without warning, his head twisted, not turned. Twisted all the way around, bones didn't crack the way his did. His eyes locked onto mine, hollow and too wide. I stumbled backward, my breath caught in my throat. Then in the corner of my vision, another one. A woman, standing perfectly still between the shelves, her face blank. And another, 4, 5, 6, all of them just standing there, heads twisting too far to face me. I sprinted out of the library, shoving through the front doors and into the daylight. My breath came in short gasps, my hands shaking. The street outside was normal. Cars passed, people walked. But when I looked back through the library's glass doors, the shelves were empty. Not a single person inside. Had I imagined it? I backed away, my pulse still racing. I needed to get home, to lock my doors, but then I heard it, from across the street, a whisper, my name. I turned, and there, standing on the opposite sidewalk, was Mrs. Thompson. She smiled, tilting her head, her eyes unblinking. And then, slowly, she lifted her hand and waved. Not a normal wave, a slow, deliberate motion, fingers bending at an unnatural angle, a mocking wave. Like she knew exactly what I had seen, and worse, that it wasn't over. I decided I needed a break from my house, from my neighborhood, from the constant, unblinking stares. Maybe I'd been imagining things, maybe stress was making me paranoid, so I packed an overnight bag and booked a last-minute stay at a hotel downtown. The moment I stepped into the city streets, something felt different. The air was thick with a strange tension, but I shook it off. The glowing lights, honking cars, and the murmur of people felt like a much-needed dose of normalcy. I checked into the hotel, a modest place with a classic design. The receptionist, a middle-aged man with tired eyes, barely looked at me as he handed me the key. "8th floor," he said in a flat voice. The elevator ride was smooth but eerily silent. When I reached my room, I locked the door behind me and let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The bed was firm but comfortable. The window offered a perfect view of the bustling city below. This was good. This was normal, until I noticed something. Across the street, in the high-rise opposite my hotel, the lights were on in every single room. Dozens of them, and in every window, a figure stood perfectly still, facing outward, watching. I closed the curtain immediately, heart pounding. Maybe it was just a trick of my mind, just people going about their night, but a sinking feeling in my gut told me otherwise. I tried to distract myself with television, flipping through the channels. But no matter what I turned to, the same strange broadcast kept appearing: a dimly lit street, empty yet buzzing with a low, static-like hum. No hosts, no dialogue, just that endless, desolate street. And then, the screen flickered. A new image appeared. It was a live feed of me, sitting on the bed. The hotel phone rang. A slow, deliberate knock followed. And then, silence. I sat frozen, staring at the hotel room door. The knock hadn't come again, but the weight of its presence lingered in the air like a held breath. The phone still sat in its cradle, silent now, but I couldn't shake the feeling that if I picked it up, someone or something would be there, waiting. The air in the room felt tight, pressing against my skin like an unseen force. I turned back to the TV. The live feed of me sitting on the bed had disappeared, replaced once again by that strange, dimly lit street. It stretched endlessly, empty sidewalks lined with flickering street lamps. No people, no movement, but the longer I stared, the more I felt something staring back. I forced myself to move. I had to do something. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but where would I go? My house, the neighbors who never slept, the city streets where eyes lurked in every window. The knock came again. Louder this time. I stood, heart hammering, and slowly approached the door. I hesitated before pressing my eye to the peephole. Nothing, just an empty hallway. I swallowed hard. I could almost hear my own heartbeat in the silence. Then, without warning, the knocking erupted in a furious rhythm, rapid and violent, like a desperate, frantic demand to be let in. I stumbled back, and then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The silence was deafening. I waited. 1 second, 2, then a whisper so faint I could barely be sure I heard it. "Let us in." I turned and grabbed my bag. I wasn't staying here another second, but the moment I yanked open the door, the hallway wasn't empty anymore. They were standing there, dozens of them, rows of people lined up along the walls, standing perfectly still, heads tilted slightly to one side, watching, waiting, their eyes locked onto me, unblinking. Not a single one of them moved, but I felt them leaning toward me, even though their feet never left the ground. The air was thick, suffocating. I took a step back, they took a step forward, and then the hotel lights flickered. And they all smiled. I slammed the door shut, pressing my back against it, as if that thin piece of wood could somehow keep them out. My breath came in quick gasps, my mind struggling to process what I had just seen. The hallway lined with them, all staring, all waiting. The knocking resumed immediately, slow, rhythmic, almost patient. "Let us in." The whisper slithered through the crack beneath the door, chilling my spine. I gripped my bag tightly. I had to get out of here. Staying in this room was just as dangerous as stepping out into that hallway. I scanned my surroundings, looking for another way out, the window, It was the only option. Rushing to the glass, I pulled back the curtain and froze. The city outside wasn't the city I remembered. The streets stretched into an unnatural darkness, as if light itself refused to touch them. The buildings were different, taller, twisted, their edges warping like a mirage, and below, standing in neat rows on the sidewalk, were more of them. The neighbors, the watchers, the ones who never slept, they stood still, faces turned upward, staring directly at me. A sharp click behind me sent my heart into overdrive. The door. I spun just in time to see the handle turning, slow and deliberate, as if whoever was on the other side knew I was trapped. I wasn't waiting to see what happened next. I yanked the window open, feeling the rush of cold night air slap against my face. I was on the second floor high, but not high enough to kill me if I jumped. The alley below was empty, a narrow passage leading between buildings. A safer bet than what waited behind that door. I threw my bag down first, bracing myself on the ledge. My muscles tensed, the knocking had stopped, and then, just as I swung one leg over, "Where do you think you're going?" The voice was inside the room. I turned my head slowly, dread pooling in my stomach. The lights flickered violently, and standing right in the center of the room, inside the locked hotel room, was one of them. Smiling, eyes wide, watching, I let go. The fall was a blur of wind and weightlessness before my body collided with the pavement below. Pain shot through my legs, but I didn't stop moving. I scrambled to my feet, grabbed my bag, and sprinted into the darkness of the alley. Behind me, I heard the hotel window creak open, and then, ever so softly, laughter. My breath burned in my chest as I ran through the alley, my footsteps echoing against the damp brick walls. The air was thick with something unnatural, a clinging presence that made my skin crawl. The streets ahead stretched into an unfamiliar landscape, warped and wrong, like the city had been rearranged in the blink of an eye. I didn't stop running until I reached the next block. Only then did I dare to glance over my shoulder. The hotel window was still open. A dark shape lingered there, watching, still smiling. I forced my shaking legs forward. I had to put distance between myself and that place, between myself and them. The city, however, seemed to disagree. I turned a corner, expecting to find a main street something, anything familiar. Instead, I was met with an identical alley. Same damp bricks, same flickering street lamp, same eerie silence. I swallowed hard. Had I run in a circle? No, impossible. I had taken a straight path, hadn't I? I pressed on, but no matter which direction I took, the layout refused to make sense. Roads twisted back into themselves, buildings repeated like a broken record, and the deeper I ventured, the more I felt like I was inside something rather than moving through it. And then I saw them, scattered across the sidewalks, standing beneath dim streetlights, silent, motionless, watching the neighbors. Their eyes reflected the glow of the lamps, glassy and unblinking. They lined the streets in perfect rows, their expressions eerily neutral. As if they were waiting, my pulse roared in my ears. I turned sharply and sprinted toward the nearest store, a 24-hour convenience shop, its neon sign buzzing weakly in the oppressive silence. I shoved the door open, sending a harsh chime through the empty aisles. Inside, it was disturbingly normal. Rows of snacks, shelves of drinks, and fluorescent lights that buzzed overhead. A cashier stood behind the counter, a bored expression on his face as he stared at the tiny television set in the corner. I hesitated before approaching. He looked human, normal. His skin wasn't waxy like theirs. His eyes had life in them. I swallowed my nerves and stepped forward. "Hey," I said, my voice hoarse. "Do you know where I am?" The cashier barely looked at me. "You're at Benny's Market, open all night." "Yeah, I can see that, but..." I risked a glance over my shoulder. The neighbors still stood outside, just beyond the glass. Something's wrong. This city. It's changing. The streets don't lead where they should. Do you know how to get out of here?" The cashier finally turned to look at me. His gaze lingered for a moment before he sighed. You're new, huh? I blinked. What? He reached under the counter, pulling out a cigarette and lighting it. People like you show up every now and then, running, confused, scared out of your mind. He exhaled a slow stream of smoke, watching me carefully. I gritted my teeth. So you know what's happening. He nodded once. Yeah, but you're asking the wrong question. My stomach tightened. Then what's the right question? The cashier tapped his cigarette against the counter, his expression unreadable. How long do you think you've actually been here? A cold wave of unease crashed over me. My throat went dry. Before I could respond, the door's bell jingled behind me. The neighbors had entered the store. The soft chime of the convenience store door sent a bolt of ice down my spine. I didn't dare turn around. I could feel them. Tall, still figures standing just behind me, their presence heavy like a storm about to break. The cashier flicked ash from his cigarette, watching me carefully. You're gonna want to keep your voice down. I swallowed hard. Why? I whispered. He didn't answer. Instead, he shifted his gaze toward the figures that had entered the store. I forced myself to turn. They stood just inside the doorway, perfectly still. Their clothes looked freshly pressed, not a wrinkle out of place. Their hands were empty, yet something about the way they held themselves made it seem like they were carrying something just out of sight. And then I realized they were all smiling, not in a friendly way, not in a comforting way, but in a way that was wrong. Their lips stretched too wide, their expressions fixed like mannequins pretending to be human. The cashier exhaled slowly. You've got about 30 seconds before they decide what to do with you. My pulse thundered. What does that mean? They don't like rule breakers. You ran, didn't you? You tried to leave. He shook his head. That's not how this works. I backed up slowly, bumping into a shelf of candy bars. I don't understand. Where am I? One of the neighbors stepped forward. His voice was smooth, polite. You're home, he said. No. I took another step back. The store felt smaller now, the aisles narrowing, the ceiling pressing down. The fluorescent lights flickered, casting shadows in places they shouldn't. The cashier put out his cigarette and sighed. You've got two choices, man. I turned to him, desperate. What choices? He nodded toward the door. Walk out of here with them. Act normal, be a good neighbor. Or, he reached beneath the counter and pulled out something small and metallic. A key. I stared at it. What does that open? The back room. He said, it's a gamble, but it's your only chance at something different. A sharp, cold voice interrupted. We'd really rather you come with us. The neighbor closest to me said, tilting his head just slightly. His smile widened. I looked back and forth between them, my mind racing. If I left with them, would I become one of them? Would I forget who I was, just like the others? Or did the key hold a different kind of danger? I had seconds to decide. The neighbors were waiting, smiling, unblinking, watching, and the cashier. He just held out the key, waiting to see if I was desperate enough to take it. I stared at the key in the cashier's outstretched hand. It was small, silver, and slightly worn, as if it had been passed through many hands before mine. Behind me, the neighbors waited, silent, smiling, unblinking. The cashier gave a small nod, barely perceptible, urging me to take the key. My fingers closed around it, and the moment I did, the lights flickered violently, plunging the store into brief darkness. When they came back on, the neighbors were closer, too close. I gasped and stumbled backward, heart hammering in my chest. The cashier moved fast. He reached under the counter and pressed something. A buzz sounded, and a door at the back of the store clicked open. Go, he hissed. I didn't need to be told twice. I bolted, pushing through the swinging door into the back room. The moment I stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind me, and everything changed. I expected a cramped storage room. Shelves stacked with inventory, maybe an emergency exit. Instead, I found myself in a long, dimly lit hallway. The floor was covered in a dull green carpet, the kind you'd find in an old office building. The walls were beige, featureless, stretching endlessly in both directions. A low, humming sound vibrated through the air, like an old fluorescent light struggling to stay alive. I turned back to the door. It was gone, vanished. I pressed my palms against the wall where it had been, but it was solid. No seams, no handle, no way back. I was trapped. The humming sound grew louder. Then a voice, faint, distant, echoing down the hallway. "You shouldn't have taken the key." My breath hitched. The air felt wrong here, thicker, heavier, like I was breathing in something that wasn't meant for me. The walls pulsed subtly, as if the entire hallway was alive. Another voice, this one clearer. "Keep moving, don't stop. If you stop, it sees you." I didn't wait to find out what it was. I started walking. The hallway stretched endlessly ahead, every step feeling slower, heavier, like the air was thickening around me. The humming grew louder. The walls trembled slightly, like they were breathing. Then something moved. A shadow, flickering just beyond the edge of the dim light. It wasn't human. Its shape was wrong. Too tall, too thin, shifting like smoke. And it was following me. I quickened my pace. The hallway twisted, turned, led me past doors that had no handles, no windows. Each one had a number painted on it. 4A4B4, see the numbers repeated. The same sequence, over and over. Something was wrong with this place. It wasn't just a hallway, it was a loop. I was going in circles. And whatever was following me was getting closer. A whisper skated across my ear. "If you see the door with no number, run." My pulse slammed against my ribs. My feet moved faster, half running now, and then I saw it. A door, plain, featureless, no number. The whisper came again, urgent this time. "Run." I didn't hesitate. I sprinted toward it, slamming my body against the wood, fumbling with the key. The air behind me shifted. The humming turned into a low growl. I shoved the key into the lock and twisted. The door burst open, and I fell forward, into something else entirely. I tumbled through the door, barely catching myself before hitting the ground. But something felt off. The air was lighter. The walls weren't pulsing. The endless hallway was gone. I was somewhere else. Slowly, I pushed myself up and took in my surroundings. It was a room, but not just any room. It was my bedroom. The same bed, the same bookshelf, even the same pile of laundry I had ignored for days. I was home. For a brief, blissful moment, relief washed over me. Had I imagined all of it? The neighbors, the grocery store, the hallway. Maybe I had just dreamed the entire thing. I let out a shaky breath and ran a hand through my hair. Then I noticed something strange. The door I had just come through wasn't my bedroom door. It was the same plain, unmarked door from the hallway. And it was still there. A chill slithered down my spine. I reached for the knob, heart pounding. I had to know if I could go back. If the hallway was still, the door disappeared. Right in front of me, one blink, and it was just gone. A deep unease settled in my stomach. My instincts screamed at me that something was wrong. I turned to my bedroom window. Outside, the street was quiet, bathed in a soft glow from the streetlights. Everything looked normal, but it felt different, like I was standing in a copy of my room, a near-perfect replica, except for something subtle, something I couldn't put my finger on. I stepped toward the door leading to my hallway. I hesitated. Then, slowly, I turned the knob. The hallway outside looked fine. But when I stepped out, I stopped cold. At the end of the hall, standing perfectly still, was my neighbor. Not one of them, all of them, lined up side by side, silent, expressionless, watching me. Their eyes were unblinking, their smiles too wide. My chest tightened. "How did you get in here?" I whispered. None of them answered. Then, in perfect unison, they took a single step forward. I stepped back into my room. They stepped forward again. I slammed the door shut. My hands shook as I locked it, heart racing in my chest. What was happening? I pressed my ear to the wood. Silence, then a knock, soft, deliberate. A single voice spoke from the other side. "We let you leave once. We won't make that mistake again." I stumbled backward, my breath coming fast. The lights in my room flickered. The air seemed thicker again. I spun around and nearly screamed, because standing behind me, in the center of my room, was another version of myself. Eyes hollow, face blank, watching me, it smiled. "You should have never taken the key." Then the lights went out. Darkness swallowed the room. The air turned heavy, pressing against my skin like an invisible weight. I couldn't see, I couldn't move. My breath came out in ragged gasps, the only sound in the suffocating void. Then a whisper, "You shouldn't be here." The voice was mine. A flicker of dim light pulsed through the room, just enough for me to see it. The figure that wore my face. It stood motionless in the center of my room, staring at me with hollow, shadowed eyes. But its face was wrong, too smooth, too perfect, like a mask stretched over something else. It tilted its head slightly, the motion unnatural, mechanical. I took a step back. It took a step forward. My back hit the door. My hands fumbled for the knob, desperate to get out, to escape whatever this thing was. "This is mine now," it said softly, its lips barely moving. The voice. My voice felt empty, like it had been copied, stripped of anything human. I twisted the knob locked. The thing's grin widened. It took another step, moving closer, slow and deliberate, as if savoring the moment. I could feel the pressure in the air shift, the temperature dropping. It raised one hand, and then the walls breathed. The entire room shuddered like something alive, something waking up. I had to get out, now. I turned, slammed my shoulder against the door. The light bulb above flickered violently. The moment it flared bright, the thing was gone. Silence. I spun around, heart hammering. Nothing. No sign of it. Just my bedroom, still and quiet. For a long moment, I stood frozen, every muscle in my body tense, waiting for something, anything, to move. Then I heard it, a sound that shouldn't have been there, breathing, but not my own, behind me, slow, deep right at my ear. I turned and my reflection was smiling, not me, my reflection, grinning wide, stretched too far, unblinking. It raised a hand and knocked on the glass, once, twice, then it stepped out. I didn't even have time to scream. The moment its foot touched the floor, my body locked up, frozen in place, as if some invisible force held me still. It took a slow step forward, now standing directly in front of me, face to face. It raised a hand, fingers curling as if reaching for me. Then bang, bang, bang. A loud, rhythmic knocking came from my bedroom door. The thing wearing my face stopped. Its head snapped toward the door, eyes narrowing. Another knock, then a voice, "You need to come with us." I knew that voice. It was my neighbor, the ones who never slept, the ones who had been waiting. I was trapped between whatever was on the other side of that door and whatever had just crawled out of my mirror. The knocking didn't stop. It grew louder, more insistent. "You need to come with us, now." The voice from the other side of the door was calm, but there was an urgency beneath it. I didn't know what was worse, the thing that had just stepped out of my reflection, or the neighbors who never slept. The thing in front of me hadn't moved. It was watching the door, unblinking. Its face, my face, twitched like something underneath was shifting, pressing against the skin. The knocking stopped. A silence fell over the room. Then the door handle turned. I barely had time to react. The reflection thing snapped its head toward me again, its mouth stretching wide in an unnatural grin. I ran, not toward the door, toward the window. The second I moved, the thing lunged. I didn't see it. I felt it. The air shifted, like something massive was rushing toward me. I threw my weight against the window, fingers fumbling to unlock it. Too slow, a hand grabbed my wrist, ice, cold, too strong. I was yanked backward with inhuman force. My feet left the ground, then crack. I hit the floor hard, my vision blurred. The breath was knocked out of me. Above me, the thing crouched low, pressing me down. Its skin was peeling. Pieces of my face, my features, were beginning to slough off like melting wax, revealing something dark and shifting underneath. Something wrong. This is my life now. It whispered, voice distorted. The bedroom door burst open. Light flooded in. 3 figures stood there. My neighbors. They moved fast, too fast. One of them raised their hand, and I saw something silver. A blade. No, a mirror, the moment the reflection. Thing saw it, it screamed, not just a sound, a vibration. A horrible, gut-wrenching frequency that rattled the walls, made my bones feel like they were about to snap. The neighbors didn't flinch. They stepped forward. The tallest of them held out the mirror, angling it so the thing could see itself. The screaming stopped. The thing froze. Its head twitched violently, as if struggling against some unseen force. Then it collapsed, fell to the floor like a puppet with its strings cut. I scrambled back, gasping for breath. The neighbors stared down at the unmoving figure. One of them spoke, voice quiet. "You should have never looked into that mirror." I opened my mouth to respond, but my brain was still trying to catch up. I glanced at the thing on the floor. It was still breathing, shallow, raspy, and then I noticed. Its face was changing, becoming less like mine. Distorting, the neighbors didn't wait. They grabbed me firm but not rough, pulling me up. "We have to go," the woman said. I hesitated. "What is that thing?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. The three of them exchanged a glance. Then the man holding the mirror said, "It's what happens when you stay awake too long." That made no sense. But there was no time to argue. They were already leading me toward the door. I risked one last look over my shoulder. The thing on the floor twitched. Its fingers curled. It wasn't done yet. I followed the neighbors out into the night. I didn't know where they were taking me. But for now, they were my only chance. The night air hit me like a shock to the system. Cold, crisp, too still. The three neighbors moved quickly, guiding me away from my house. Their grips were firm but not forceful, as if they knew I would follow but didn't trust me not to hesitate. "Where are we going?" I asked, my breath still unsteady. No answer. We rounded the corner of the street, and that's when I noticed all the other houses had their lights on. Not a single window was dark. I slowed. Why was everyone awake? "Keep walking," the woman said, her voice low. I turned my head, glancing through the nearest window as we passed. A family sat around their dinner table, except they weren't eating. They weren't moving at all. They just sat there, eyes open, unblinking. It wasn't just that house. The next one had an old man standing at the front door, perfectly still, staring out at the street. His hands were at his sides, stiff and unmoving. His mouth was slightly open, like he had been caught mid-sentence and had never finished speaking. I swallowed hard, my skin crawling. What the hell is happening? The tallest neighbor, the one who had held the mirror, finally spoke. "You've seen too much. You're one of us now." I stopped walking. "What does that mean?" He turned to face me, his expression unreadable. "It means sleep will never come for you again." A chill shot down my spine. "That's not possible." The woman gave a dry, humorless laugh. "That's what we all thought too." The way she said it, like she had lived through this exact conversation before, made my stomach twist. "I don't belong here," I muttered. "Neither did we," the third man said, speaking for the first time. I took a step back. I was shaking. This couldn't be real. I just needed sleep. I was imagining things. I turned, ready to run back to my house, and that's when I saw it. The thing that had worn my face. It stood at the far end of the street, still, silent, watching. Its face was no longer mine. It had changed warp, like melting wax, shifting between different features. But it had eyes now, and it was looking right at me. "It's not done with you," the tallest neighbor said. "None of them ever are." The woman placed a hand on my shoulder. "Come with us. It's your only chance." I turned back toward her, my heart hammering. "Chance for what?" She hesitated, then answered, "To survive." The words lingered in the cold air. Behind me, I heard the thing take its first step forward. A sound like wet fabric stretching. I didn't look back. I followed them into the nig. The three neighbors led me down a narrow side street, deeper into the quiet, eerie neighborhood. The air was colder here, thick with something I couldn't name, not fog, not misty, something heavier. It clung to my skin, sinking into my bones. I didn't ask where we were going. I was too afraid of the answer. The woman walked ahead, her steps quick but deliberate. The tallest man stayed by my side, his gaze flicking to the houses around us, as if checking for something unseen. The third man, the quiet one, walked behind, his presence unsettling. He never once turned his head, yet I felt him watching me. At last we reached a house. It looked like all the others. Same architecture, same windows, same uncanny stillness. But something about this one made my stomach churn. The woman pulled open the front door, revealing complete darkness. Inside, now, I hesitated. Why, what is this place? The tallest man finally spoke. A place where the rules are different. Rules, I echoed. He gestured behind me. I turned and saw the thing standing at the end of the street. It had followed us. But it wasn't alone. There were more, dozens. Standing in the glow of the streetlights, bodies shifting, faces morphing between familiar and wrong. Some of them had no faces at all. Just smooth, empty skin where features should be. They weren't moving yet. But they were waiting, inside. Now, the woman repeated, pulling me in by my arm. The door shut behind us, sealing us in complete darkness. A single match flared, casting an eerie glow. The woman's face flickered in the dim light. This house is the only place they can't reach you. Not yet. Why? I asked, my voice hoarse. Because this house doesn't exist. The tallest man said. I blinked. What? He stepped forward, the light casting long shadows across the wooden floor. It was erased, the same way we were. A shiver ran through me. What does that mean? The woman blew out the match. Darkness swallowed us again, and in the silence I heard something moving, not inside, outside. The things were shifting on the other side of the walls. But the walls weren't solid anymore. They were thinning. I stumbled back. They're coming. I whispered. The quiet man finally spoke. No, he said, they're already here. Darkness thickened around us, pressing in like a living thing. I could hear them moving outside, not footsteps, not scraping, but something in between. Like shifting skin against wood, like breath against glass. The air inside the house was wrong, heavy, like the space itself didn't want to exist. What do you mean, this house was erased? I whispered. The woman struck another match, her face flickering in the dim light. This place was taken out of the world, scrubbed from maps, erased from records, forgotten by time. The tall man stepped forward. It shouldn't be here, and neither should we. I backed away, my pulse hammering. Then why did you bring me? The quiet man, the one who had spoken only once, tilted his head. Because you were never supposed to exist either. A cold wave washed over me. What? The woman blew out the match. Total blackness again. Then the walls groaned, a low, hollow sound, like a dying breath. I spun toward the door, and froze. The wood was peeling away. Not cracking, not splintering, peeling, curling back like burned paper. The outside was bleeding in. Through the gaps in the wall, I saw them. The things, dozens of them, maybe hundreds. Their faces, if they could be called faces, twisted and warped as they watched. Their bodies weren't solid. They flickered, shifted, stretched in ways that defied logic. And then, one of them stepped forward. Its hand, if it was a hand, pressed against the disintegrating wall. The wood melted under its touch. We have to move, the woman whispered. The tall man grabbed my arm. There's only one way out, he said. He gestured toward the back of the house, where a single door stood in the darkness. A door that hadn't been there before. The air behind it pulsed like something breathing. Through there, the woman said. I shook my head. Where does it lead? The quiet man turned to me. Somewhere that still remembers us. A crack split through the ceiling. Something slithered inside the walls. We were out of time. The woman yanked open the door. And the world on the other side wasn't the one we left behind. It was moving, a shifting corridor, stretching and collapsing like a living thing, and it was waiting for us. The tall man pushed me forward. Go. I hesitated. I glanced back. The wall behind us collapsed. The things outside surged forward. Their mouths opened, but there was no sound, just the absence of it. I turned and ran, and the door swallowed me whole. The instant I stepped through the door, the air changed. It wasn't just a shift in temperature or scent. It was a shift in reality itself. The moment my foot hit the ground on the other side, I knew. I wasn't anywhere I had ever been before. The corridor pulsed like it was alive. The walls weren't made of wood or plaster. They were something else. Not quite flesh, not quite stone. Something between. They rippled as I moved, like the entire space was breathing around me. The woman came through next, her breath shallow. Then the tall man, gripping his knife so tightly his knuckles were white. The quiet man followed last, shutting the door behind us. And that's when I noticed there was no handle on this side. "Where are we?" I whispered. The woman didn't answer. She just took a slow step forward. The corridor stretched ahead of us, twisting and shifting as though deciding where it wanted to lead. And the further we walked, the less real things felt. The floor wasn't wood. It wasn't carpet. It wasn't anything I could understand. With each step, it seemed to forget what it was supposed to be. My shoe landed on something hard. The next step. Soft, the next. Cold like metal. The next. Wet. I stopped. The woman turned back. "Keep moving." "Where are we going?" I asked again. This time the tall man answered, "Somewhere they can't reach." I glanced over my shoulder. The door was gone. No, not gone. Just erased. Like it had never been there. A cold shiver crawled up my spine. The quiet man stepped ahead of me, his face unreadable. "Stay close," he murmured. We walked for what felt like hours, or maybe minutes, or maybe no time at all. Because something was wrong. The corridor never ended. It just kept shifting, turning, stretching, looping in ways that made no sense. The woman stopped. "Something's wrong," she whispered. The tall man frowned. "What do you mean?" She looked around, her fingers twitching. "This place, it's watching us." I swallowed hard. I had felt it too. Not eyes, not a presence. Something deeper. Like the space itself was aware of us. The walls shivered. The ground rippled. And suddenly everything stopped. The corridor ahead of us vanished. There was only blackness. A vast, empty void stretching out forever. And as I stared into it, I realized it wasn't just black. It was moving, shadows twisting, shapes forming and dissolving. Something was inside, and whatever it was, it had been waiting for us. The woman grabbed my wrist. "Don't look at it." But it was too late. I had already seen, and it had seen me. The shadows lurched forward, not crawling, not slithering, just appearing. 1 second they were distant, the next, right in front of me, reaching. The tall man shoved me aside. Run, but there was nowhere to run. The corridor was gone. The void was all that was left. And then a single door appeared. Not ahead of us, not behind us, above, hanging in the darkness, floating, pulsing like a heartbeat. A door that shouldn't exist. A door that led nowhere. The quiet man spoke for the first time in what felt like forever. "We have to go through it." My breath hitched. "How it's..." But before I could finish, he jumped, and the door swallowed him whole. The woman turned to me. "You trust me." I couldn't speak. I couldn't move. The darkness was closing in. She grabbed my arm, then jumped. The shadows reached for my feet. I closed my eyes and leaped. The instant I jumped, the world bent. There was no falling, just a sickening pull, like being yanked through space without moving at all. My stomach twisted, my skin tingled, and for a split second, I wasn't sure if I even existed anymore. Then impact. I hit the ground hard, rolling onto my side. The first thing I noticed was the silence. No echoes, no whispers, no shifting walls or pulsing shadows. Just stillness. I gasped for air, my chest heaving as I pushed myself upright. The others were already here. The quiet man stood motionless a few feet ahead, staring at something unseen. The tall man was doubled over, hands on his knees, breathing hard. And the woman, she was looking at me. "We made it." I didn't answer, because I didn't know if we had. This place, wherever it was, felt wrong. The sky above us wasn't a sky at all. It was flat, a dull, gray stretch of nothingness that seemed to press down, heavy and suffocating. There was no sun, no moon, no clouds, just a void of color, like a sky that had forgotten how to be a sky. The ground beneath me was equally unnatural, not dirt, not stone, something smooth, like the surface of a mirror. But instead of reflecting our images, it reflected nothing at all. I stood up, testing the weight of my steps. The surface didn't bend or break beneath me, but it also didn't feel solid. "Where are we?" I asked. The quiet man didn't look at me. Somewhere between. Between what? He finally turned, his face unreadable. Between what was and what will be. The woman exhaled sharply. "That doesn't help. It's the only answer I have." I felt my pulse in my throat. Everything about this place screamed wrong. It wasn't dead, exactly. It was waiting. Something was here. Watching, listening, waiting. "We can't stay." The tall man muttered. "Then where do we go?" I asked. He didn't have an answer. None of us did. The only thing in this endless, gray expanse was the door. Still standing upright, despite the fact that there was no wall to hold it. Still pulsing, like a living thing. It had brought us here, but now it just stood there, like it had done its job, and now we were on our own. I took a hesitant step forward, feeling the weight of the nothingness pressing against my skin. There has to be a way out. The quiet man was still watching me, his expression unreadable. "There is," the woman frowned. "How do you know?" He didn't answer. Instead, he raised his hand and pointed. I followed his gaze and my blood ran cold. There, on the horizon, where the gray met the gray, a shape. Small at first, distant but moving, getting closer, a figure, no. Figures, I counted 5, then 10, then 20, all identical, all walking toward us, silent, purposeful, and the closer they got, the clearer I could see they had no faces. Just smooth, blank skin where eyes and mouths should have been. And somehow, I knew they weren't coming to help. They were coming to take. The woman grabbed my arm. "We need to go. Now." The quiet man took a slow breath. "It's already too late." And as the faceless figures drew closer, something clicked in my mind. I had seen this before. Not in a dream, not in a nightmare, in a book. A book I had never touched, never read, never known existed until now. And suddenly I understood. This wasn't just a place. This was a story that wasn't finished yet. And we were about to find out how it ended. The faceless figures moved in silence. No footsteps, no breath. No sound, just motion. 20, no more, 30, 40, 50. Each identical, each featureless, each moving directly toward us. A silent army of nothing. And yet, the closer they came, the more I felt it. An unnatural pull, not like gravity, not like magnetism, something deeper, something inside me, like they were reaching for more than just our bodies. The tall man clenched his jaw, gripping his knife so tightly his knuckles turned white. "What the hell are they?" The quiet man didn't answer. Because I think he already knew. The woman grabbed my wrist. "We have to run." "Where?" I asked. There was nothing. No walls, no structures, no roads, just the endless gray. Except the door, still standing, still pulsing. Still watching, the woman followed my gaze. "No. It's the only way. We just came from there. What if it brings us back?" I swallowed hard. What if it doesn't? She didn't argue, because behind her the figures were close, too close. I could see their hands pale, smooth, stretched too long. Fingers curling, reaching, grasping, not out of hunger, not out of rage, out of inevitability. Like they weren't chasing us, like they were simply here to collect what was already theirs. I didn't wait, I ran, the woman followed, then the tall man, then, finally, the quiet man, straight for the door. The faceless figures didn't speed up. They didn't need to, because the closer we got to the door, the slower we moved. Like the air itself had thickened, turning to molasses. Each step took more effort. Each breath felt heavier. And with every second that passed, the figures gained ground. The tall man gritted his teeth. "We're not gonna make it." I ignored him. I focused on the door. Just a few more steps, a few more seconds, and then the quiet man stopped, dead in his tracks. "Wait!" We skidded to a halt, barely inches from the door. "What the hell are you doing?" the tall man barked. But the quiet man didn't move. He was staring at the ground. No, not at the ground, at something beneath it. I frowned, following his gaze, and then I saw it. The words, scrawled in messy, Inkai script spreading across the smooth surface beneath our feet. Like someone was writing them in real time. They had reached the door. They had nowhere else to go. And behind them, the faceless figures arrived. My breath caught in my throat. It wasn't just describing what was happening. It was controlling it. This is a story," I whispered. The woman's face paled. "What?" "This place, it's being written as we live it." And if that was true, then it meant one thing. We're not in control of what happens next. The tall man cursed under his breath, spinning toward the door. "I don't care, we're going through." But the quiet man grabbed his arm. "No." "Why the hell not?" The quiet man hesitated. Then he pointed. I followed his finger, my stomach dropping. Because now, on the door itself, words were forming. "New choices only lead to the same end. The only way out is to finish what was started." I felt a chill creep up my spine. "What does that mean?" the woman asked. The quiet man exhaled slowly. "It means the ending has already been written." And behind us, the faceless figures stopped. Not reaching anymore, not moving, just waiting, because they already knew how this ended, and soon, so would we. The air in the space felt thick, not with dust, nor heat, nor any physical weight, just something unseen. A pressure that coiled around my ribs, squeezed my lungs, and filled my skull with a silent, static hum. It was like the very air around us was waiting, watching. The faceless figures stood still, 50 of them. No, more, a crowd, a silent audience, each identical, featureless, pale and impossibly smooth, as though they had never needed expressions. As though they had never needed identities at all. And yet, I could feel their gaze, no eyes, no faces. But still, they were looking at us, at me. I swallowed against the dry, static saturated air, my own voice small and fragile against the overwhelming silence. "What do you mean, the ending has already been written?" The quiet man didn't answer immediately. He only lifted his gaze to the writing that bled into existence across the door. "New choices only lead to the same end. The only way out is to finish what was started." The words weren't carved. They weren't printed. They simply formed one stroke at a time, like invisible fingers tracing ink onto the surface of reality itself. I watched as they flickered, shifting between barely there and too real. Something in my chest twisted. "It's a story," the quiet man said finally. His voice was steady, but something beneath it. A slight tension, a breath held too long told me he wasn't unaffected. "We are in a story." The woman exhaled sharply. "That's impossible." He glanced at her, but there was no argument in his expression. No need to convince her, because he knew the truth didn't require belief to exist. The tall man clenched his fists. The knife in his hand trembled just slightly. "Then we force the ending to change," he said. His voice was rough, desperate, determined, but the quiet man only shook his head. "That's not how stories work." My pulse pounded in my ears. "Then how do they work?" I wanted to ask. I wanted to scream it, but I didn't, because part of me already knew the answer. Stories have momentum, they have paths, and once a story is in motion, it does not stop. The faceless figures took a step forward. Not all at once, just one, just enough, a single, soundless movement, but we felt it. The woman stiffened beside me. The tall man's fingers flexed around the hilt of his blade. We were running out of time. I turned to the door. "What if we go through?" I asked. The quiet man's jaw tightened. "Then we follow the script. And if we stay?" He hesitated. And that was all the answer I needed. Behind us, the faceless things took another step forward. "We don't have a choice," the woman whispered. "But we did, didn't we?" I turned back to the door, and the words on it changed. Right before my eyes, the letters shifted, melted, rearranged themselves into something new. 2 options: enter and play your part, refuse and become unwritten. The air turned frigid. My skin prickled, breath turning shallow. Unwritten, the woman echoed, voice barely more than a whisper. No one answered her, because we didn't need to. The quiet man had said it already. This was a story. And if something in a story stopped existing, it wasn't just erased. It was never there at all. I looked at the figures, the ones that had been creeping forward, slowing their pace now, sensing that we had reached the choice. They're not here to kill us, I murmured. The tall man exhaled through his nose. Then what are they? I turned to him, then to the woman, then finally to the quiet man. He met my gaze. His eyes were dark, tired, knowing. They are what's left of the ones who refuse to play their part. A silence, a deep, pulling, suffocating silence. The woman swallowed hard. Then she cut off, turning her gaze to the door, to the words still waiting there. Enter and play your part. Her fingers trembled at her sides. We have to go through. I felt my heartbeat hammer against my ribs. What if it's worse? She shook her head. It's already written. The faceless figures moved, this time all of them. Soundless, swift, their limbs gliding through the air in one synchronized motion. They had waited, but the waiting was over. Now, I lunged for the door. The quiet man was the first through, slipping into the void beyond. Then the woman, her breath sharp and ragged. The tall man hesitated, only for a second. Then, with a sharp inhale, he jumped through. The figures surged forward. I was the last one left, and as I stepped toward the threshold, the words changed, again. Behind the door, the ending awaits. My breath caught, then I stepped through, and the door slammed shut behind me. Darkness, not the kind that comes from closed eyes or an unlit room. This was something deeper, a darkness that didn't just obscure sight, but swallowed it whole. I wasn't sure if I was standing, falling, or floating. There was no floor beneath me, no sky above, only endless, weightless black. Then a flicker, distant, weak, but there. A tiny pulse of light, like the last ember of a dying flame, and then sound, not voices, not words. Something older, a whisper woven into the air itself, something I could feel more than hear. I wasn't alone. Somewhere in this abyss, something was watching. A breath passed through the space around me, stirring the air in a way that shouldn't have been possible. And with it came a single whisper, thin word, found you. A hand cold, dry, impossibly smooth, wrapped around my wrist. I gasped, tried to pull away, but the grip held firm, not painful, not aggressive, just absolute. The light flickered again, closer this time, illuminating just enough for me to see the shape before me. Not a person, not a creature, a form, tall, shifting, featureless, but its presence pushed against reality itself. Like it didn't just exist in this space, but was part of it. You stepped into the ending, the voice murmured. Not from the form, not from anywhere, just everywhere, now it sees you. The cold grip on my wrist tightened. Not painfully, just enough for me to feel the weight of it. Do you understand what that means? I swallowed hard. No. A pause, then laughter, low, quiet, but laced with something ancient. It means the story is no longer bound to ink and paper. The flickering light pulsed, stretching into something wider. A doorway. Beyond it, I could see shapes. Figures, but they weren't just standing. They were watching, waiting. Dozens, hundreds, thousands, all turned toward me, their gazes pressing against my skin like phantom fingertips. The readers, watching, waiting for what would happen next. The thing that held my wrist shifted, tilting its faceless head. They have always watched from the other side. It whispered, but now they see you too. A cold dread settled deep in my bones. Who are you? I whispered. The fingers loosened slightly. Not a name, not a title, just a word, author. The light flared, and I stepped forward, into the unknown. The light swallowed me whole. Not in a painful way, not in the way fire devours paper or shadows creep across the ground. This was something deeper, something that pulled rather than burned, something that turned my existence inside out and remade it with whispers. Then, I was standing again, not in the abyss, not in the endless dark, but somewhere, familiar, a hallway. My hallway, the air smelled like home. Stale coffee, old books, the faintest trace of rain from the open window down the hall. But something was wrong. The door, the one at the end of the hallway, the guest room door, it was open. That door was never open. Even when I had guests, even when I cleaned, even when I forgot to check, it always stayed closed. But now it stood ajar, just enough for darkness to spill from the crack like ink bleeding into the light. And from within that darkness, something breathed, slow, steady, a presence that filled the space beyond. It sees you. The whisper wasn't from the room. It wasn't from the hallway. It was from everywhere. From the walls, from the ceiling, from the spaces in between the moments of my own breath. It sees you now. I took a slow step forward. The floor didn't creak beneath my weight. The air didn't stir. Everything was still, frozen, holding its breath. Another step, another. The door widened on its own, a little more, until the darkness beyond wasn't just a shadowed room. It was something else, a place that shouldn't be, a place that wasn't a place at all, not a room, not an abyss. Something alive and waiting. I could turn back. I could leave the door as it was and pretend I never saw it open. But something deep inside me whispered that it wouldn't matter, because now it knew I was here, and soon it would step through. The door stood open now, not just ajar. Open. Behind it there was no guest room, no furniture, no walls. Just a vast, shifting blackness, rippling like liquid silk under an unseen force. I should have run. I should have turned away, slammed the door, and pretended I never saw what lay beyond it. But I didn't. Because something stood inside that darkness. Not a person, not exactly. It had a shape, a presence, a stillness that was almost human. But its edges blurred, like a figure drawn in wet ink, forever shifting, never quite complete. It didn't move. Didn't speak, but it was looking at me. I felt it. A weight in the air, a knowing gaze pressing into my skin. The breath I didn't realize I was holding came out in a slow, uneven shudder. Who are you? And no answer. The shape only adjusted, like it was considering me, measuring something unseen. And then, a whisper. Inside my head, not spoken aloud. Not yet. A slow pulse rippled through the darkness, like the whole space was breathing. Then, a sound from behind me. Footsteps, not mine, slow, deliberate, coming from deeper inside the house. I turned sharply, heart pounding. Nothing, just my apartment, the hallway stretching toward the living room, the dim glow of the kitchen light in the distance. But the air had changed, thicker, more aware, like the walls themselves were listening. When I looked back at the doorway, the figure was closer. It hadn't moved, hadn't taken a step, but it was closer all the same. The threshold between us, between my world and whatever lay beyond that door, had grown smaller. Not yet. The words echoed again, heavier this time, like a warning or a promise. My breath hitched. And then the door slammed shut. The whole apartment shuddered with the force. Silence, no footsteps, no whispers, just my own racing heartbeat, filling the empty space. I reached for the doorknob cold, unnaturally cold. But when I turned it, the door was locked. It had never locked before. I stood there for a long time, hands still gripping the knob, staring at the blank surface of the wood. Whatever I had seen, whatever had seen me, it wasn't gone, just waiting. I didn't sleep that night. Even with the door shut, I could feel it, something watching, something waiting. Every time I closed my eyes, I swore I heard footsteps just beyond the door, soft, deliberate, pacing. By morning, the feeling hadn't faded. If anything, it had grown stronger, but I wasn't staying here. Not today. I left my apartment, stepping into the too quiet hallway. The air outside should have felt lighter, less oppressive. It didn't. The moment I locked my door behind me, I felt it. A presence, Not from inside my apartment this time. From somewhere further down the hallway, the neighbor's door, the family, the ones who never slept, the ones who always watched. I had lived next to them for months, and I had never, not once, seen them leave. Never heard their door open, never heard them speak, but they were there, always there, and now, for the first time ever, their door was slightly ajar. A thin sliver of darkness gaped between the wood and the frame, as if inviting me closer. I swallowed hard. I should have walked away. I should have ignored it, but something in my gut told me that they knew something, that they had always known something. I stepped forward, slow, careful. The closer I got, the heavier the air became. Like stepping through invisible water, I reached the door. It wasn't locked. It was barely even closed. I raised a hand, knocked once. Silence, knocked again. Silence. Then a whisper, not from inside the apartment. From right behind the door. We were wondering when you'd come. A shiver rolled down my spine. The voice wasn't unfamiliar. I had heard it before, in my room, inside my own apartment, whispering, breathing, waiting. I stepped back. The door creaked open, just an inch, enough for me to see a single eye peering out from the darkness within. It wasn't human, not fully. The iris was too wide. The pupil stretched, pulsing, like it was adjusting to the dim hallway light. "You should come in now," the voice whispered. I shook my head, no, but my body didn't move. I couldn't move. My feet felt glued to the floor, like something unseen had wrapped around my ankles. My pulse hammered. Something pulled at me, not physically, not with hands, with something deeper. Like I was being reeled in by an invisible thread, drawn closer to the dark threshold. "We've been waiting." The whisper came again. Something moved behind the door, a shape, more than one. A presence too large for the apartment itself. The hallway lights flickered, and then the door slammed shut. The force of it broke the spell. I staggered back, gasping, heart pounding against my ribs. For a long moment I just stood there, staring at the silent door. Nothing moved, no more voices, no more whispers, but as I turned to leave, something on the floor caught my eye. A slip of paper slid beneath their door, resting at my feet. I bent down, picked it up. One sentence, written in perfectly neat handwriting. "Don't let them in tonight." I stared at the words, swallowed hard, then turned my gaze back to my own apartment. My bedroom door, my room where something had already been inside, where something had already touched me. A chill wrapped around my spine, because suddenly I realized it wasn't them I had let in. It was something else entirely. And it was already waiting for me to come home. I didn't go home that night, not after what I saw, not after what I heard. Instead, I found myself driving aimlessly, the slip of paper still clenched in my fingers. "Don't let them in tonight." The words felt heavier the longer I stared at them. What did they mean? Had I already let something in? Was it the thing that whispered in my room? Was it something worse? I didn't know. I didn't want to know, but I had to. I couldn't avoid it forever. Somewhere along the way, my car had taken me to an all-night diner on the outskirts of town. Neon signs flickered in the window. The parking lot was empty, except for one car, a black sedan. Its windows were tinted too dark to see inside. I didn't like it, but I was too exhausted to care. I stepped inside the diner. A single waitress stood behind the counter. She didn't look up, didn't acknowledge me, just kept stirring a cup of coffee, even though there was no one sitting there. The only other person in the diner was a man in a booth by the window, an old man, face hidden by the brim of his hat. Hands folded on the table. He wasn't eating, wasn't drinking, just waiting. I took a seat at the counter. The waitress finally looked at me. Her eyes were dark, too dark. "Coffee?" she asked. Her voice was flat, like she had been expecting me. I nodded. She poured the coffee. I didn't drink it. I could still feel the old man watching me. Not directly, but I knew he was. I turned my head. He was still sitting there, unmoving. Then, slowly, he raised a hand and beckoned me over. I hesitated, but something in my gut told me this wasn't random. He knew something. He knew about them. I grabbed my coffee and walked over, slid into the booth across from him. For a long moment, he didn't speak. Then, you saw them, didn't you? His voice was quiet, gravelly, like he had spent a lifetime whispering secrets. I swallowed. The family? I asked. He shook his head. Not them. He murmured. He reached into his coat, pulled out something small, placed it on the table between us. I stared. It was a photograph, a picture of a house. An old one, rotting wood, dark windows, and on the porch, a single shadow, no features, no face, just a silhouette. Watching, this is where it started. The old man said, his fingers tapped the photo. It's not just the family, kid. It's something else, something older. And if it's in your house. He trailed off, but I understood. If it was in my house, then I was already marked. I clenched my jaw. How do I stop it? The old man exhaled, long, slow, then he slid something else across the table. A key. Rusty, old, but something about it made my skin crawl, like it was wrong. Go to the house, he said. I frowned. What's inside? The old man finally looked up, and for the first time, I saw fear in his eyes. If you're lucky, he whispered, you'll never find out. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. The old man's words echoed in my head. Go to the house. The rusted key was still in my pocket, warm against my skin, as if it had been sitting in sunlight instead of the old man's hands. I gripped the steering wheel, staring at the road ahead. The diner was gone now, swallowed by the dark. There was nothing but emptiness around me, just open road stretching into the unknown. I checked the rear view mirror. The black sedan was gone. Had it ever been there? The question sat heavy in my chest. I drove. The directions were simple. A straight shot down the highway, then onto a dirt road that wasn't marked on any map. I found it easily. Too easily, like it had been waiting for me. The trees thickened as I went deeper in. The road narrowed. Branches scraped against the sides of my car like fingernails on glass. The further I went, the quieter it got. Even my own breathing felt too loud. Then the trees opened up, and there it was, the house, exactly like the photograph. 2 stories, sagging porch, a front door that leaned slightly open, as if someone had just stepped inside. And the shadow, it was still there, not a person, not a trick of the light, just a shape, standing on the porch. Watching, waiting, I gripped the key. My heartbeat was slow, too slow, like the house itself was pulling me into its rhythm. I stepped out of the car. Leaves crunched underfoot. The air was thick, heavy, like it was pressing down on me. I climbed the porch steps. They groaned beneath my weight. The shadow didn't move. It didn't flinch. It just stood there. Then it was gone. Not like it had disappeared. More like it had slipped into the house. Waiting for me to follow, I swallowed hard. The door was open just enough for me to see inside. Darkness. A hallway stretching into nothing. No furniture, no sound, just a feeling, like something was breathing in the walls. I stepped inside. The door slammed shut behind me. The slam of the door reverberated through the house, swallowing the last trace of the outside world. I turned sharply, gripping the rusted key like it was a weapon. Nothing. No one, just the house. The air inside was different. Thick, stagnant, like it had been holding its breath for years. I took a cautious step forward. The floorboards groaned under my weight, but the sound didn't echo. It was absorbed, swallowed by something unseen. The hallway stretched before me, impossibly dark despite the faint slivers of moonlight creeping through cracks in the boarded windows. Then I saw them, footprints not mine, leading deeper into the house, barefoot, too small for a man, too large for a child. I swallowed hard. A single bulb hung from the ceiling, flickering erratically, as if unsure whether to stay lit or die completely. The walls were covered in old wallpaper, yellowed, curling at the edges, peeling away like dead skin. Something was scrawled beneath it. I reached out, running my fingers along the exposed wood. The words were carved deep. Not written, scratched, I remember you. A chill ran through me. I stepped back, heart pounding. A floorboard creaked not under my foot. I spun around. The hallway stretched longer than before. Doors lined both sides, doors I hadn't seen when I first stepped in. Each one slightly ajar, each one whispering. I stepped toward the closest door, pushing it open. A bedroom. Dust coated every surface, but the bed was neatly made, the covers smooth, untouched. A mirror stood in the corner, its glass cracked in jagged veins. I moved closer. At first, my reflection looked normal, but then it blinked. I didn't. My breath hitched. The reflection tilted its head a fraction of a second before I did. A delay, like it was watching me rather than copying me. The bulb in the hallway flickered again. Then, in the silence, a whisper, right behind me, "You never should have come back." I turned. The room was empty, but the mirror was no longer cracked, and my reflection was smiling. The air inside the house had changed. Heavier, denser, it wrapped around me like a thick fog, pressing against my skin. I took a step back from the mirror, my pulse hammering in my ears. The reflection still smiled, but I wasn't smiling. Its lips stretched wider, too wide, pulling unnaturally at the corners. Then, it raised its hand. I didn't move, but it did. It pressed its fingers against the glass slowly, one by one. Tap, tap, tap. A cold sweat broke across my skin. This isn't real. It's just my mind playing tricks on me, I told myself. I turned away, and then the glass shattered, not inwards, outwards. Shards flew across the room, embedding into the walls and floor. I shielded my face, heart pounding. A whisper crawled up my spine. "You're not supposed to be here." The room lurched. I stumbled, grabbing onto the bedpost. The floor shifted beneath me, like the house itself was breathing. Something was wrong, very wrong. I bolted for the door, but the hallway outside wasn't the same. The doors that had been ajar were now shut. The walls seemed closer together. The bulb above flickered faster, erratic, and then I saw it, at the end of the hall. A silhouette, tall, still, waiting. I froze. It didn't move, but I could feel it watching me. A low hum filled the hallway, like a swarm of distant insects vibrating through the walls. And then the doors behind me slammed open, one by one. Bang, bang, bang. Shadows spilled out from inside, curling toward me like living smoke. The figure at the end of the hall tilted its head. The hum grew louder. My pulse pounded in my skull. Then it took a step forward. The lights died, and the whisper came again. "You should have stayed asleep." Darkness swallowed the hallway. I stood frozen, my breath shallow, the whisper still curling through the air like smoke. "You should have stayed asleep." My fingers dug into the wooden doorframe behind me. The house felt alive now, breathing, shifting, waiting. And the figure at the end of the hall. It had taken another step closer. Even in the suffocating dark, I could see it. Tall, unmoving, featureless, not a shadow, not a person. Something else. I swallowed hard, every muscle in my body screaming at me to run. The walls groaned, the old wood twisting and creaking like bones settling into place. I took a step back, and the floor buckled beneath my feet. The world tilted. For a split second, I was weightless. Then I was falling, plunging downward through open air. But there was no ground, no end, just darkness. I reached out, desperate for something to hold on to, and my hands caught something cold, smooth, wet. Flesh, 1,000 fingers clawed at my arms, grasping, writhing. I gasped, but the air was thick, heavy, wrong. It filled my lungs like liquid. Distant voices whispered all around me, overlapping, merging. Not one voice. Hundreds. "Don't wake up. Stay with us. You belong here now." I fought against the hands, kicking, twisting. My body slammed into something solid. Pain exploded through my ribs, and then light. A single, flickering bulb swung above me. I was lying on a dining room table, but not just any table. It was set for dinner, silverware, plates. A long, rotting feast, and across from me, they were seated. Figures in dusty suits and tattered dresses. Their faces blurred, featureless, but they were all staring at me, waiting. At the head of the table, a man without a face lifted a glass in my direction. A toast, and then, in a voice that didn't belong to him, he spoke. "You made it just in time for dinner." The faceless man tilted his glass. The liquid inside was thick, dark, and slow, moving like molasses or something worse. "You made it just in time for dinner." My heart slammed against my ribs. Every muscle in my body screamed to move, to run, to wake up. But I was frozen in place. The air felt thick, heavy, like I was breathing in something unseen. The long, rotting banquet table stretched out before me, the plates piled high with food that should not exist. Rotten meat glistening with decay, fruits swollen and split open, oozing something dark, a roasted bird, except its eye was still moving. And the people, they sat perfectly still, dressed in old-fashioned suits and dresses, their clothes covered in dust, moth holes eaten through the fabric. But their faces were blurred, shifting, melting into nothing, like a smudge in reality, like something that shouldn't exist. A single knife clinked against a plate, then another, a fork scraped. They weren't eating, they were waiting for me. The faceless man lifted his own silverware, slow and deliberate. "Eat," he said, his voice wrong-layered, echoing, as if multiple people were speaking at once. "I'm not hungry," I choked out. His head tilted slightly. The entire table shifted toward me in unison. "You should be," he said. "You have been asleep for so long." Something moved beneath the tablecloth. I saw the fabric ripple, stretch bulging, as something crawled underneath. The thing slithered past my feet. The guests remained still. I felt something coil around my ankle. I jerked back, but it tightened. My pulse pounded in my ears. The faceless man's head turned too far on his neck. "Eat," he repeated, and this time it was not a request. The thing beneath the table yanked. My chair tipped. I plunged downward, but instead of hitting the floor, I was falling into something else. Not darkness, not nothingness, something worse. A place that had been waiting for me all along. The whispers rose up again, hundreds of voices overlapping. "You should have never woken up." And then silence. I fell, but I never hit the floor. The world around me stretched, twisted, collapsed. It was like being pulled through a hole in reality, like gravity had suddenly become something else, something alive. The voices whispered all around me, "You have been here before. You should have never left. Wake up, wake up, wake up." I hit the ground with a force that should have shattered every bone in my body, but there was no pain. Just cold, unbelievable bone. Deep cold. I gasped, pushing myself up onto trembling hands and knees. My breath came out in white clouds, swirling like mist in the dim, flickering light. I wasn't in the dining hall anymore. I was in a hallway, long, endless, too narrow. The walls were covered in pictures, dozens, hundreds, maybe thousands, and every single one was of me. Me as a child, me as a teenager, me standing in places I didn't recognize. And some were of me in this house, on the staircase, at the top of the attic ladder, at the foot of the bed in the master bedroom. Watching myself sleep, I turned, heart hammering, and my breath caught a door at the end of the hallway. It was slightly open. Light spilled from within, warm, flickering candlelight. The whispers grew louder. "Go inside. It's time." My hands trembled as I reached for the doorknob. I didn't want to go in, but I knew. I didn't have a choice. I pushed it open, and inside was me, sitting in an old wooden chair, staring directly at me. His my expression was unreadable. But his eyes, they were empty. I took a step inside, and the door slammed shut behind me. The other me smiled. "I've been waiting," he said, and then everything went dark. Epilogue. I woke up in my bed. The sun was rising outside my window. Birds chirped. The world was normal again. No whispers, no faceless man, no endless hallways, just my room. But then I turned over, and there, sitting in the chair across from my bed, was the faceless man, smiling, waiting. The end.